Okay. Ethan Tapper is a forester, digital storyteller, and a best-selling author of How to Love a Forest, the bittersweet work of tending a changing world. For more than a decade, Ethan has been recognized as a thought leader in the world of ecosystem stewardship, winning numerous regional and national awards for his work. More recently, he has been recognized as a writer. Since its publication in 2024, How to Love a Forest has been named the winner of the 2025 New England Book Award for Nonfiction and received international acclaim. Ethan's message of relationship, responsibility, and hope reaches millions of people each year through his writing, social media channels with hundreds of thousands of followers, and the hundreds of walks, talks, and keynotes that he delivers across North America each year. Ethan works, writes, hunts, does some birding, and runs a small consulting forestry business from his home at Bear Island, his 175-acre working forest, his homestead orchard and sugar bush in Vermont, and plays in his punk band, The Bubs. I've had a chance to purchase this book and read through the first chapter and introduction. I think you're going to be pleased to hear him speak tonight. Uh, his writing's fantastic. If you get a chance, be sure to purchase this book. Ethan, the Zoom screen is yours.
Thank you. Um, hey everybody, all the way over from snowy, freezing cold Vermont. I think it was about -14 outside right now, and I'm glad to be in here with you all. So as Barry mentioned, my name's Ethan Tapper, and I'm a forester, but now I often say that I don't know what I am because over the last year and change, my life has changed a lot. And so I had the honor and the privilege of writing this book, which will look backwards in your screen. It's called How to Love a Forest, the Bittersweet Work of Tending a Changing World. And then I've been just so amazed and privileged to get to travel all over the country and talk about it. And when people ask me sort of like what How to Love a Forest is about and what I talk about and think about and write about, what it really is this concept of like ecological responsibility. And I know that you all know this very well, that there's this thing that people can do and that we have to do, which is this ancient act of stewardship, right? Where we care for this world that we live in. And it's this incredibly like beautiful and hard and at times bittersweet process of like answering this question of how do we live here? How do we live here on this earth with all of these other species, with these ecosystems that are so deeply wounded in many cases? And the answer to those questions aren't easy. So I want to just talk to you a little bit about the book and my life and my story, and then sort of weave it into the things that we share, which is the stewardship of these ecosystems. So I have to tell you first that I'm not a writer by training. I'm certainly not a social media influencer by training. That when people ask me how I learned how to do these things, I tell them that I learned to do it the same way I learned to run an excavator, which is that I just kind of got in it, and over time it got a little less bad. So about 9 years ago, there was some stuff that I wanted to write about. And I'd never written a book. I'd done some informational writing as a forester. At the time, I was working as a forester for the state of Vermont. And there was some stuff that I wanted to say. And so I got it in my head that I was going to try and write something about it. Now I believe that if I had tried to write a book, there's no way that I would have done it because it would have been too scary, too intimidating. I never would have even gotten started. But I realized that there was this time in my day, the first hour that I'm awake, when I was just like such a good little worker and I was shooting off all these emails and I was doing all this stuff, and foresters get up early in the morning. So for me, this was 5 to 6 a.m. And I was just like, firing on all cylinders. And I said, what if I took this time and I kept it all to myself. And I started to write for that first hour of my day every day, 5 to 6 in the morning. And it became this practice that was just like such a wonderful way to start every day, where I'd get up and I'd be drinking my coffee and typing away. 6 o'clock rolls around. I close the laptop. I go work in the woods. And it felt like what I was doing was every day taking a little stone, no bigger than my fist, and like stepping off my back porch and just chucking it back there. It's this act that by itself is totally insignificant, completely meaningless, but you do it again and again and again and again and again. And then one day you look back there and you're like, that pile's getting pretty big. So I did this writing practice, just writing for an hour every day for 6 years. And then I was like, geez, I have a book here. And I found a publisher for the book. And I was like, this thing's going to be out by the end of the week. And the publisher said, your publication date is in 2 years. And that brought us to September of 2014. Now, at the same time that I was doing this really like incremental process of writing this book, I was doing another process, which many of you will be familiar with, which is this process of stewardship. In 2017, I bought this forest that I named Bear Island, which is really featured in the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about it later. That was, at the time, the most degraded forest I'd ever seen. A forest with every problem that a forest could have, a forest that, for me, was like a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. And even though I'd been working as a forester, and even though I, had helped other people manage their land, I didn't know how to just like heal this forest and bring it back from the brink of collapse. So what I did was just one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, with every little bit of time and energy that I had, tried to do something to make things a little better. And at the same time that I was writing How to Love a Forest, I was engaged in this other incremental process of trying to heal this land, Bear Island. And over the course of those 8 years, I saw it go from being a forest that was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, a forest with every problem that a forest could have, to, in my eyes, really being a symbol of what's possible and a symbol of hope. Now, when I started to write How to Love a Forest, the thing that made me really want to start to say something was that I felt like there was this idea sort of in the general public that there was this dichotomy, right? So over here, we have anybody who like does anything to an ecosystem must just not care about them. Over here, people who love ecosystems, and so we leave them alone. And this is an attitude that makes total sense until you actually like get to understand these ecosystems really well, and you understand the complexities of this moment and the threats that they face and the stressors that they face. And you start to see that actually, at times, the greatest act of compassion can be to do stuff to help them heal from the wounds of the past, to deal with these profound threats and stressors that they face in the present, and then to move into this future that promises challenges like never before. And I wanted to tell a love story, really. I wanted to tell the love story of me and Bear Island, the measures that were necessary to care for this ecosystem. And I think that are common to many of our different ecosystems where, if we think about these great love stories of our time, very infrequently do you hear these stories where it's like, these two people met and they fell in love and that was it. And everything was good forever, right? It's about, these great love stories are about how we climb mountains and cross rivers and how we make compromises and sacrifices and do things that we never thought we'd have to do because of this sense of responsibility. And to me, that is such a greater expression of care and compassion than just leaving everything alone and hoping for the best, right? And I wanted to tell that story. So I do want to do maybe a couple of readings, maybe just one reading. We'll see what we have time for from the book. And the first reading that I want to do is from the introduction, where I sort of talk about what inspired me to write the book in the first place. Once, it seemed that there were only two paths to follow: a status quo that saw forests and other ecosystems as commodities, and an opposing force that sought to protect ecosystems from ourselves, to leave them alone. As forests everywhere struggle under the weight of the many threats and the stressors of the modern world, as they suffer the legacies of the past and confront a future that promises challenges like never before, I've realized that neither of these two paths is enough. I've realized that the world needs action intertwined with compassion, relationship imbued with responsibility, death infused with life. I have gone my own way, fostering a divergent vision, a reimagining of what it means to love a forest, engaging in the radical act of trading simplicity for complexity, trading a tidy vision for one that is true. My journey toward these realizations has been long and lonely and sinuous. In my little house at the foot of the mountain, my bookshelf is crowded with books about trees and plants and animals, birds and bears and fungi, the relationship between people and ecosystems, and the threats both face. Never have I found a book that has articulated what a forest truly is, not just its botany and its biology, the contours of its many pieces and its parts, but how this entire living community moves and behaves and changes. Never have I found a book that described what it means to care for a forest like Bear Island, an ecosystem that has been changed and degraded and depleted and left to suffer alone. Never have I found a book that described the pain and the joy and the anxiety of trying to love and protect an ecosystem, of guiding it toward wholeness at this strange and crucial moment in time. No book has prepared me for the many complex and bittersweet choices that I would someday make at Bear Island, or for the fact that these actions would be celebrations, the substance of a truly radical and responsible relationship with the forest. In this book, I draw these disparate threads together, exploring what it means to love a forest in this changed and changing world. In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent. This is a vision both for how we manage forests and take care of ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other. So another big theme of this book is also just like understanding our role in these systems. I did an event with the scholar, Dr. Lila June Johnson, an Indigenous scholar. And she said something that I really like, is a really good way to put it, which is like, she said, I think my job is to free people from the existential shame of being a human being, right? Where we're like, those of us who know ecosystems, we're like, whoa, we have really harmed these things, these amazing, beautiful systems and these amazing, beautiful species that rely on them. And also, what are we going to do about it, right? And recognizing that like we have an impact and that impact can actually be positive, right? And that just because we've had bad examples of stewardship in the past or management in the past doesn't mean that we can't be good stewards in the future. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about myself. It's been one of these fun things where, with the book and getting to do these hundreds of events, talking about it, where people ask me about how did I become a forester? How did I end up writing a book? How did I get interested in all this stuff? And so like a superhero, I get to have an origin story, which is very fun. And it was especially fun because I, at the time when I was living my life, every choice I made seemed to be like haphazard and random. And then you go back in time and you're like, oh, this is how this led to this, led to this, led to this. So this is my origin story. I grew up in this little teeny town in southeastern Vermont called Saxton's River, Vermont. It's like 300 people and it's surrounded by forests. But even in this rural context, and even as I spent time in forest, because it was just like the only place around, I had no idea that I wanted to work in ecosystems at all. And, now when I read these stories, interviews, accounts of some of my heroes, these nature writers and ecologists and biologists, almost every one of them is always like, I was always the nature kid. I was like down in the dirt looking at bugs, and I was tracking deer, and I was always outside, and I always knew that this is what I wanted to do. That wasn't my experience at all. What I do remember is that I wanted to get out of there really bad. And I remember my junior year of high school telling somebody, probably everyone who would listen, I said, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont. Because where I come from, everybody goes there, and it feels like this huge cop-out. Well, the first month of my senior year of high school, I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me I got this in-state scholarship called the Green and Gold Scholarship, which is a full scholarship. And I was like, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. No principles, no integrity. I said, just do that. And even once I got there, though, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I was taking all these random classes, and it just happened that my high school girlfriend, first big love of my life, as I was finishing up my second semester, she was coming back from this 5-month wilderness program and this expedition. And when she came back, she had had this like huge life-changing experience. And I'd just been hanging out, doing what 19-year-olds do. And we weren't connecting, and it was freaking me out. And I thought we were going to break up. And so I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition. And the next expedition with that program left in 2 weeks. And it was a 6-month expedition where we skied north for 3 months, and we built a canoe, and we canoed back down. Now, in retrospect, I did this for no reason. The relationship didn't work out, but it totally changed the course of my life. And after that, all I wanted to do was just work in the woods. And I ended up working as a wilderness guide, and I lived in this like uninsulated yurt in the woods of Maine with a fir bough floor for a year. I worked with draft animals, did a little bit of draft horse logging. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that if I didn't come back, I was going to lose that scholarship. And I remember sitting on the bow floor of my yurt, holding a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont. And I scrolled down and I saw forestry, and I didn't know what it was, but it had the word forest in it. True story. And I said, try that. Now, it was funny because once I got back to school, I had been like living in the woods for years. And I was like, what are these fancy school people going to tell me about forests? And so I went back with this whole attitude. And I really had this understanding of these forests where I was just like, they're these perfect things. They're these totally utopian, perfect places. It's completely driven by like altruism and collaboration, and they're just perfect. And then I went to forestry school, and I started taking all these classes in forest ecology and wildlife biology and natural history and dendrology and hydrology and geology and soil science and all of these different components that combine to describe this amazing living system that we call a forest. And I realized that actually these forests that I'd seen as being these perfect, pristine, utopian places were actually deeply wounded and deeply imperiled. So I think an important term for us all to know is this term called global change. And you'll see this in the literature. Global change is the term that encompasses all of the different things that are happening to ecosystems right now. So it's things like climate change, and it's things like introduced species, introduced plants, animals, pests, and pathogens. It's things like deer overpopulation, forest fragmentation, deforestation, pollution. Where you are, it might be things like the loss of large herbivores in those tall grass prairies, the loss of natural and indigenous fire. All of these different things that combine to create the sum total of the threats and the stressors that face our ecosystems, right? So one of the things that's important to know is that like any one of those things by itself would be an existential threat to the function and to the integrity of ecosystems. But all of those things are happening to ecosystems at once. And so as we're thinking about like how we're going to solve these problems, we really need to think about not just one piece at a time, but to understand that they're all part of this larger system. So there's an awesome quote by Aldo Leopold that I will probably butcher right now, which is that he says, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives in a world of wounds, right? So there's this process that happens, and this is what happened to me when I went to forestry school, where, for most people, they go out into a forest or maybe a prairie, and they're just like, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. It makes me feel calm and peaceful, and I love it. And then you go a little deeper. And when you go deeper, suddenly you start to see all this other stuff. I actually think I'm going to do another reading for you from How to Love a Forest about this process. It's a process that I now think of as the process of deepening, where it's like we don't even have to go to a different place in terms of develop some new understanding and become a different person to appreciate this. We just have to go deeper, and suddenly the same forest can look different. And what it means to care for that same forest can be different. So in this is a reading from the first chapter of the book. And in this one, I'm pruning the apple trees in my orchard here at Bear Island, which again is just not a real island, but just the name that I gave my forest, and comparing this sort of like orderly, tidy system of this orchard with the wild forests around it. A group of chickadees visits me, flitting from fence to fence. I pause to watch their circus. As my pruning shears quiet, I hear nuthatches and dark-eyed juncos, the pounding of a pileated woodpecker on an aspen. As I've learned to recognize more of the forest birds, a cacophony has become a chorus. Each species of bird calls its own name. Each touches the forest in a different way, each finding habitat within different pieces and parts of this living community. Each is unique. A decade ago, I looked into the forest and saw faceless trees, each like the others. As I learned to tell sugar maple from red maple, the flat needles of hemlock from the angular needles of spruce, the peeling bark of paper birch from the creamy bark of aspen, the forest has become a creature of diversity and complexity and depth. Each tree species is habitat for different birds, insects, and mammals, each growing on different sites and in different ways, each flourishing different flowers and bearing different fruits. Each is precious. Once I saw forests as no different from orchards. I have since learned to reimagine the forest as something messy and imperfect, complex and undefinable, dynamic and expansive over space and time. I have learned to see the trees in the forest as the coral in a coral reef, the living structure at the center of a community of boundless depth and diversity. I have learned that an understanding of what healthy forests look like, how they work, and what it means to take care of them is not something that any of us are born with. It is something that we need to develop. I have learned that forests are not supposed to be pleasant or understandable or beautiful to us. They are what they are, and it is up to us to meet them there. Now, when I look into the forest, I see kaleidoscopes of interactions and connections, critical pieces and parts as diminutive as a bed of moss on a rotting log, and as massive as a mountain, a region, a continent, a biosphere. Now I see that the fungi and the bacteria of the soil, the insects, the mosses and the lichens, the beech and the oak, the deer and the owls and the bears, these things do not live in the forest. They are the forest. The windstorms and the ice storms, the forest fires and the floods, the death and the change, These things do not happen to the forest. They are the forest. Once I thought that being a forester meant being a caretaker of trees. Now I see myself as the caretaker of a reimagined forest, the steward of every piece of this incredible volume of life. So the very most basic form of this deepening that I think about, this education, ecological education, is just like learning what stuff is. And for me, this happened, even though I grew up around these trees my whole life, it happened when I took this amazing dendrology course at the University of Vermont, and we really learned to identify different species of trees. And suddenly, I realized that for my whole life, I had been seeing trees, a forest of trees, right? And then suddenly I saw that there were all these different tree species, and that they were all telling us different things about a forest, past, present, and future, and that they were all different. And it added so much more complexity to my understanding of these forests. And being in these forests became so much more interesting and exciting. And the same thing has happened to me more recently, like in the last 5 years, when I became a birder. Now, I cannot tell you for how many years I just walked through the woods, and I guess I didn't hear the birds, or I just heard something called bird song, which now I have no idea what that means. And then suddenly, once you learn to identify these birds by song and, visually, you're like seeing and hearing all this stuff that just wasn't there for you before. I remember that when it was last summer, my mom asked me to come and do a talk at the community center in my little hometown. And as I was walking to the community center, I instantly heard chimney swifts. Now, chimney swifts are a fascinating bird species. They are simultaneously an old growth bird species because historically they roosted in these like big hollow trees. They can't take off from a horizontal surface, only from a vertical. They're these aerial insectivores that almost need to never land. They just hunt insects all day long. And they're cousins to the common swifts of Europe that basically never land and have the ability to turn off half their brain so they can sleep while they're flying. Every day, twice a day, they fly 8,000 feet up in the air and do these things called vesper flights, where they're probably trying to predict tomorrow's weather by looking at weather fronts that come in. They're fascinating. So chimney swifts are a New World swift and are just like so cool. And when they're hunting, and so now I should say, they're an old growth animal because they used to colonize all those big old hollow trees. But when those big hollow trees were cut down, they were like, oh, chimneys are a pretty good place to roost as well. And so now they've actually become extremely dependent on that chimney habitat for their roost. And they've been declining as chimneys are less well used and as they become capped in many cases across the region. So I was walking to this community center and I heard chimney swifts, and I looked up and I saw them darting around. And I realized that for my whole life, I had been hearing and seeing chimney swifts, and also neither hearing nor seeing them. And, on one hand, we could think of that as something that's incredibly sad. How sad is it that as I was growing up in this little town, I didn't realize that there were chimney swifts roosting in all the chimneys and flying overhead. But it's also a profound opportunity, right? Like, we have an opportunity as people who love ecosystems to bring people in deeper, to show them the wonders of these species and these ecosystems, and to make their life better, right? And to also bring them into this sense of responsibility that comes with when we really understand where our ecosystems are at. So lastly, I want to tell you a story about this land, Bear Island. But first, I want to caveat all this by saying that, in the work that I've done over the first 10 years of my career, all based in Vermont. Like, I am a forester who is trained to work in the forests of Vermont. And then for the last year and a half, I have been doing talks and walks and keynotes all over the country. And one thing that is pretty amazing and also very humbling is realizing how different all these ecosystems are. Like as you go across, from the Northeast, like to the Midwest, I keep on seeing these tree species that I know or that are related to tree species that I know that are just behaving really differently. It's important to recognize that ecology is incredibly local, right? And requires a really deep understanding of all of these different elements that combine to create the ecosystems that we have. So the things that I'm dealing with in my forest will be different from what you're dealing with in your forest, right? So I'm going to tell you this story about Bear Island, and just know that the solutions and the situations are not going to be exactly the same, but they are going to be parallel. So I had this vision, this idea that I wanted to, as I was helping all these other people manage their forests, as a consulting forester, a private forester, and then as a county forester, which is a service forester, a public forester for the state of Vermont, I had this idea that I wanted to have a forest of my own, as I was helping all these other people manage their forests. And my friend one day said, "Hey, did you see that piece of land for sale?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." And we pulled it up on this realtor's website. And it was funny. It said 175 acres, and it didn't say anything about the forest at all. It just had this picture of this amazing view of this mountain that we call Camel's Hump, which is like the currency of real estate in this area. Everybody wants their view of Camel's Hump. And it was as if to say, like, don't worry about that forest. Just build your mansion right here, and you can look at Camel's Hump. I looked at the price, and I was like, geez, it's pretty cheap. I wonder what's wrong with it. And then I went to go find out. And my first impression was I drove up onto this old logging road, truck road, and it hadn't been properly stabilized. And there was a ravine cutting right down the center. I had to straddle it with the wheels of my truck. And then I rolled up onto this clearing, log landing, which is where that picture of Camel's Hump had been taken from. And it was covered in trash, bags of household trash, tires and cables and hydraulic hoses and busted pieces of equipment half buried in the ground. And going out from it in every direction, this network of these logging trails, skid trails, with these 3-foot deep skidder ruts just bleeding murky water down the mountain. It was not a good way to start. But I said, I'm here. I'll go take a walk. And I started walking up the main trail, and it was incredibly steep. I was getting covered in sweat, covered in ticks. And I was walking. And eventually, as I was walking, I sort of realized consciously that something was bothering me. And I couldn't put my finger on it. I was like, what's bothering me? And eventually, after about an hour, I realized that what was bothering me was that there were no healthy trees in this forest. I realized that, and then I was like, that can't be right. I started looking around, couldn't find a healthy tree. Every tree I saw was diseased, stunted, dying. And what I now know happened is that 30 years before, the previous landowner had told these loggers, just go cut every tree bigger than 10 inches in diameter on the mountain. That's what we call a diameter limit cut. And what it really is this thing that we call high grading, which is where you go into the forest and you cut all of the most valuable high grade trees, and you leave all the least valuable low grade trees standing there. And it's the opposite of what any responsible forester, landowner, logger would ever do. You're managing the forest to be less healthy. But that's what they did. And I think there's an argument to be made, actually, that it would have been a greater kindness to this forest if they had just cut all the trees. And then at least there would have been enough room for a new generation of trees to establish that would have had a chance to be healthy. As it was just kind of stuck. So I kept on walking, and I saw that even in places where they had cut enough trees, that there was enough light made available to regenerate a new generation of trees. All those trees are getting browsed to death by deer. There's evidence of deer overpopulation as well, as there is almost across this country. I slid down over these cliffs that bisect the land from west to east, and right into a 30-acre patch of this introduced plant species called Japanese barberry, which along with species like honeysuckle and buckthorn are these incredibly problematic introduced invasive plants. This was a patch of Japanese barberry that was 3 foot tall, pure, 30 acres, no native plants. And I pushed through that patch of barberry, got back to my truck, and I said, forget this place. I'm going home. And I did. And, you know, it's just like, I will find a forest somewhere else that's easier to love. But sure enough, you know, over the next couple months, I saw that the forest was still up there on that realtor's website. And I started to ask myself, was this forest actually hopeless, or was there something that I could do to help? And about 2 months later, I decided to go back and take another look. And when I returned, it was summer. And I started finding all these plants that I love. Plants like sweet fern, pink corydalis, red columbine, low bush blueberry, maple leaf viburnum. I found that there were actually some healthy trees there after all that were just so hidden behind these masses of unhealthy trees that I hadn't seen them. And that there were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was standing on one of those rock outcrops when I said to myself, I'm going to try and buy this place. Didn't know how to do that, never did anything like that before. And so I called up my old boss, Mike, sold forest land real estate. And I said, Mike, there's this piece of land, and how do I make an offer, and how much do I offer? And he said, well, let me ask you a few questions. Is there any timber on it? And I said, no. And he said, any real estate potential? I said, no. And he said, is the access good? No. Is there a lot of sugar maple? Could it be a sugar bush? No. And we kept on going down the line. No, 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 no. And eventually he said, well, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Why don't you just offer them like nothing and don't be afraid of hurting their feelings? And that's how I became the owner of this piece of land, Bear Island. And I got to tell you what, it's one thing that we can say, you know, all we got to do is just get out of the way and let nature take its course, and these ecosystems will magically be okay. And it's quite another thing when you're standing on that log landing, surrounded by trash, and, you know, in a forest that with basically no healthy trees and deer overpopulation and invasive plant infestation, and you're watching thousands of years of soil roll down the mountain through those skidder ruts. And I had to ask myself in that moment if it would be a greater kindness to that forest to leave it alone, or to do everything in my power to try and make it healthy again. Now, we don't always realize it, but we are, all of us, standing on that log landing right now with tremendous power and tremendous responsibility. So in my case, I decided to do something about it. And I wish that I could tell you that all I had to do was just fill my pockets full of wildflower seeds and just scatter them like this across the mountain. It wasn't like that. What I had to do was to do things like teach myself how to run an excavator and restore these eroding, unstable skid trails. I had to cut thousands of trees, finding every healthy tree that remained, releasing it from competition with less healthy trees, and then in areas with no healthy trees at all, cutting all the trees. Teach myself to be a deer hunter and kill dozens of deer to try and lower the deer overpopulation. That was such an existential ecosystem threat. And there's one thing in particular that there's a parody to that I really like, which is that I know that 30 years ago, these loggers came to my forest, and when they came to the forest, they used these specific tools, right? They used these chainsaws and these pieces of logging equipment that we call skidders, specifically cable skidders, because there's a cable winch on the back. So timberjack cable skidders made like in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So they used these timberjack cable skidders and these chainsaws, and they created all these problems that I'm going to spend the rest of my life fixing. And today, as I heal this forest, two of my most powerful tools are my chainsaw and my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder. His name is Red. There are so many things that are like this. These tools that used in one way can harm ecosystems, and used in another way can help them heal. And there's another thing that's like that, which is us. There is no doubt that we are the greatest threat to ecosystems. There's no doubt that we've caused all the problems that they now face. And I believe there's no doubt that we are their best hope for a better future, that we may actually be keystone species in these ecosystems, that we can help them become so much more. And I'm out of time. I want to answer your question. So if you do have a question, pop it in the chat there. And so I'm just going to do a very, very short reading from chapter 3. Let's see here. So I have one. There's this term. I don't think you all probably use the same term. There's this term that we use in Vermont called a wolf tree. A wolf tree is a tree that was at one point standing alone in the middle of a field. Here in Vermont, in the Northeast, a big part of our land use history is that it was basically it was all closed canopy forest, which I know is different than your history. And all that closed canopy forest was cleared. Basically, what I tell people is that every forest you've ever been in New England was a pasture in the 1800s. Many of them maintained as pasture for the following 100 to 150 years. And then they reverted to forest like within the last 100 years. They regrew from those abandoned pastures naturally. And there are these wolf trees in the woods today, which are these trees that have this open growth form that lived alone in the middle of a pasture for, in some cases, 150 years, and then a forest grew up around them. And so I have a chapter. When I find those trees in the woods, I'm always like, what has this tree experienced? It's maybe was a tree that was a sapling in an old growth forest. Everything was cleared around it, lived with, in a livestock pasture for 150 years, and then a forest grew up around it. And so I have a chapter that's sort of about that. And at the end of the chapter, I have a little wolf tree of my own, this little oak tree that's growing at the edge of the clearing that I named the memory tree that I'm talking about. And I write this chapter in the third person. So when you hear me mention the man, that's me. All right, from How to Love a Forest. And thanks so much for hanging with me on this. The man and the memory tree grew up together. Through long summer days, the man labored in the clearing and the woods above, working hard to leave a legacy that he could be proud of. In the heat of the day, the man would rest in his chair at the base of the memory tree, drinking cool water and dreaming of many things that might someday be. He dreamed of healing, of emergence and abundance, of unwinding the threads of legacy that gripped the forest on the mountain. He dreamed of people who would accept responsibility for the forests of their lives and who would do what was necessary, however bittersweet, to help them shine again. He dreamed of a better world. Against all odds, the memory tree grew into a world of promise and opportunity, a gift to the man's children, a gift to future generations. Slowly, the man's legacy took root like an acorn planted in the earth. Across the world, the Khasi people of northern India built bridges from the bodies of fig trees, training vines into living structures of purpose and beauty. They began building each bridge knowing that it would take generations to complete, knowing that they would never walk across it. They did it anyway. It was their legacy, a gift to their children, a gift to future generations, a gift to an unknown future. Behind us, the world is crumbling. Ahead of us is a roaring stream. What bridges will we build so that our children may cross the water? Thank you very much.
Wow, Ethan, that was fantastic. You have a gift. You are definitely one of the people I could listen to talk for hours and hours and hours and still have more questions to ask. So
You
thank you
didn't
for
need,
that.
and I didn't even mention foxes, Anne,
You didn't mention armadillos either.
or armadillos.
No, but I think you owe the group your f fun fact about armadillos.
So armadillos, and I don't have personal experience with armadillos, although I know that armadillos are moving north, and I think that they're in Illinois.
They are.
Um, and there's a bunch of weird facts about armadillos, but my two favorite are the fact that they only have identical quadruplets. So when they have little armadillos, and I don't know what those are called, they're always identical quadruplets. And then the other fact is that armadillos can swim a little bit, but usually when they get to a river, they sink to the bottom and they just walk on the bottom across. They can hold their breath for
Wow.
like 4 minutes.
Wow. That, that's amazing. But I'm sure we're all going to be learning armadillo facts sooner than later with
I
them
think
marching
so.
northward the way they are.
That's right.
We do have some questions though. I'm going to read them just so that they're recorded in our recording.
Mm,
First question is from Carrie from Western New York,
mm.
and they've been having a very cold winter weather this year. Do you think that this frosty weather will help kill ticks and the woolly adelgids?
Delgid.
Uh,
Yeah, you probably don't have woolly adelgid
we
where you are,
don't.
right, Ann?
We
So
don't. I've never heard the word before, so having to read that was a little
yes,
bit of
so hemlock woolly adelgid is an introduced tree pathogen that affects our eastern hemlock trees. And it's the question asker is completely right. It's highly temperature limited. So it's like uh, it's taken out hemlock trees, which is this really amazing tree species throughout a lot of like southern New England and areas along the Appalachians. But in Vermont, it's restricted because it's in two of our southern counties. But when we have good winters, their numbers are reduced to like a fraction. They'll lose like 99%, and then it really helps us combat that species. But then of course we have normally, except for this one, we haven't been having good winters at all. But when we do have good winters and cold temps, it does help. I don't know as much about the tick thing, about if cold temps really help knock back the ticks or not. I do have one cold temp fact, which might be the same thing that actually protects the ticks, which is that there's this amazing area, this habitat that is created in the winter under snowpack. That's called the subnivean zone, which is this really cool habitat that all kinds of rodents and stuff will use. And it's basically this whole like community, this whole network of these tunnels under the snow. And it's interesting because snow is a really good insulator, and it provides both like protection from the cold and also physical protection from predators for a lot of these different rodent species, especially. And so they'll live under that snowpack, and they'll actually be adversely affected if it's cold but there's no snow because they don't have that insulation. And there's a few animals that are specially adapted to hunt rodents under the snow. One of them is the red fox. Bringing
See,
foxes into the
you did get the
equation,
fox in.
red foxes and Arctic foxes do this behavior, which is called mousing, where they'll be stalking up on something, and they have really good hearing. They can hear a mouse under a foot of snow from like 100 feet away, and they'll stalk up on them, and their ears will be cocked, and their ears being cocked gives them an asymmetry. And so the sound of the mouse will reach this ear and this ear at very slightly different times, which allows them to triangulate where it is. And there's also some research that suggests that they're also using this like incredible sixth sense that we call magnetoreception. So they're maybe able to visually perceive the Earth's magnetic fields, and that allows them, with their hearing, that allows them to triangulate where a rodent is under the snow and then they do this big jump. And there's these studies that have actually examined fox skulls that show that they're specially adapted to just like smash their face through the snow and get the rodents underneath. Some scientists like took all these fox skulls and coyote skulls and other skulls and did these experiments on them, and they're like, yeah, fox skulls are perfect for this. So that's how the foxes get over it. And owls do a similar thing where they can hear, they have asymmetrical ears as well, and they can hear the rodents under the snow, and then they fly down really fast and get through the snow.
Oh, they must taste really good. Be worth
Yeah.
all that head banging. Is that why you're a punk
Right.
rocker? Okay, another question from Paul is, and I'll let you take it in a different direction if it's not the either or he's posing. Do you feel like you have a vision of what the forest should be and are working towards it? Or are you trying to undo some of the damage that's been done and letting the forest develop as it will?
So this is actually a really good, and maybe I'm not going to totally answer this question, but this is a really good question for any of us who are just like concerned about ecosystems in general, because we have these sort of dueling perspectives in many cases, one of which is thinking about restoring a forest to like a past condition. So I'm like, what were the forests like here prior to colonization? What were they like 300 years ago? And in your case, like many of the forests that you had were probably grasslands, right? And then we have this other thing, which is recognizing that the conditions that we had 300 years ago aren't coming back. And so how do we like manage for the future, right? And there's no answer to this. One thing that I think is really important, especially from a biodiversity perspective, and I think everything in our ecosystems is built on biodiversity. I think of it as the currency of our ecosystems, because biodiversity is actually what allows all of these amazing functions, from pollination to nutrient cycling, soil formation to habitat for larger organisms. It's what allows it to occur. So I think we have to start with biodiversity. But with thinking about like the way that ecosystems were in our landscape for thousands of years is useful, because the conditions that we see in those, in some cases, like really rare or disappeared versions of our ecosystems are the conditions to which all of our native species are adapted to, right? So even though the conditions are now different, we still have this imperative where we like got to protect all these species. And so where you are, maybe that's about restoring tall grass prairie and other related ecosystems. Where I am, what that's about is restoring these old growth forests. So we didn't have in Vermont, fire wasn't a big thing. The main disturbance vector was wind. And so we would have these forests that covered probably 90+% of the state. That would have been these complex multi-generational forests that would have some big trees, but not a lot, like 10 to 12 big trees per acre, equally defined by this quality of multi-generationality, many different sizes and ages of trees, all growing together, and deadwood on the ground. And they would have been hummocky, this pit and mound microtopography, which comes from trees tipping over, pulling their root system out of the ground, and the dip where the root system came out of is what we call a pit. And then that root system would rot down and become a mound, and eventually the whole forest would look like waves almost. And then we would have had these landscapes that were these mosaics of forests of all different ages and types and at different stages of development, right? So we're never going to go back to a place where we have forests that are exactly like that. But when the cool thing about knowing that and looking at our remnant old growth forests is we're like, okay, well, we know that all of these conditions were here and were so common. And so as we try to restore habitat for our native species, we really need to make sure that we're providing those conditions. At the same time that we're forward looking, like we've lost tree species, to some of these non-native pathogens, introduced pathogens. And we've had new species introduced, like these invasive plants. And, we've lost apex predators, and and the climate is changing way faster then our native tree species can adapt. And so we need to sort of like hold these two realities at once and be trying to like maintain habitat for all those species, many of which are in steep decline because their habitats have been lost, and also be forward looking and understanding where we need to make tweaks to what that looks like.
Just kind of following up on that, how do you feel about bringing species from a more southern climate and intentionally bringing them north?
So it is something that I think we have to do. I think that in general, where we're at with it right now, at least where I am in Vermont, is we're not at the place of like totally translocating species outside of their native range and just like bringing them from, species from like Virginia to Vermont. Where we're at is recognizing the tree species, and this could be true for other plants as well, that are like at the northern end of their range, and then increasing their abundance at the northern end of their range. We call this assisted migration is like you're picking a piece species up and transporting it way north. We call this assisted range expansion. And so it's sort of like a more conservative approach to that. The other thing that's being tried right now is there's a bunch of studies in Vermont. This may seem funny to you, but in Vermont, historically, we've never really planted trees. We always just use natural regeneration. And so we're realizing we have all these gaps in understanding of like how we even plant trees well and where they even come from. So one of the studies that's being done is examining some of these different climate adapted tree species, native tree species at the northern end of their range, and then also individuals of those species that are of southerly genetic populations. So like we're at the northern end of northern red oak's range, but we're like, what would happen if we took a northern red oak from Virginia and transplanted that in Vermont? Would that one do better? And we don't know. I mean, we're trying to figure it out, but there's definitely a lot of people that are invested in this, and we hope we're doing it fast enough.
Yeah, it'll be interesting space to watch. Question from Maryland. Do you have any pictures of Bear Island or any pictures to share of your land befores and afters and the like?
You know what's funny is that when I talk about I don't know if this question asker was here at the beginning of the presentation. I did not. I'm better at taking pictures now, but at the time, like I did not anticipate that there was going to be such a dramatic change at Bear Island. So like I didn't think about like, oh, I should just take a picture of this barberry jungle, because later it'll be just all the barberry will be gone and it'll be all native plants in the understory. That didn't occur to me. And so I don't have like really great before and after pictures, but I now am very conscious about taking pictures of those things. It's like the side of a mountain. I mean, it's crazy. I sometimes joke about, I don't know why at Bear Island everything has to be like so dang hard. It's just like the ground's hard, the soil's bad, the roads are bad, the trees are bad, it's just this whole thing. And now of course I think it's like, the Garden of Eden. I think it's perfect and beautiful and everything else, but it is pretty austere and epic, but not easy. So I'll see if I can find a good picture for you that I can throw up before the end of this year.
Okay. Well, it sounds like that piece of land found the person that it needed.
It does feel that way now. It feels very serendipitous, the whole thing.
And speaking of that barberry patch, there's a couple of questions that want to know if it's still there, and if not, how in the world did you remove it?
It's gone. And so to answer this question, I have to take us on a little bit of like a nuanced little journey, because I have dealt with literally hundreds of cases of introduced plants. And especially when I was a service forester, I would walk these people's land and like, it's just this massive thing, right? Here are these plants that we introduced. that totally outcompete all of our native species and derail forest natural developmental processes and displace native plants and all of the other insects and other organisms that depend on those incredibly important relationships. And the measures that are necessary to control them are not things that most people want to do. So like the answer is I used herbicide. And when people ask me like what's the hardest thing to learn that you had to learn how to do, and what was like the hardest thing I sort of ideologically that you had to do to heal Bear Island, hunting was the hardest thing I had to learn how to do. Hunting is very, 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 very hard. And but ideologically, using herbicide was the hardest thing, because I was just like, I was just wish that it wasn't the case. And so, but now I really realized that it's one of the most radical things that I've ever done. And now it needs to be known that like, this is not something that I'm like, a wingnut who's like, use herbicide because we hate plants. But it's like actually the tool that's being used by basically every conservation organization to control that controls these species at scale. And it's really, really important. And so actually, I was pleasantly surprised when I got into forestry to learn that a lot of these questions about like, can herbicides be applied in ways that protect our soils, our waters, our biodiversity, had like already been answered. And there are totally ways that you can do it that are safe. And it doesn't create like a dead zone. You use it really carefully, use the right herbicides, with the right people, and it just can like bring a forest back to life. And I often joke that in those hundreds of people that I saw that have these invasive plant problems, I was like, I have crunched the numbers in my head, and almost every single one of those people wanted to control those plants without herbicide. And I know in my head what proportion of them were successful. 0. No successes at anything more than a backyard scale, right? And so then when that happens, you just sort of have to be like, this doesn't work. And so what are we going to do to actually control this problem? And so for me, it was like I spent one gross summer, like with a little hand pump backpack sprayer, applying super diluted herbicide to individual plants. I wasn't like mist blowing it, carpeting it. And then the next year I spent 2 days. And then the next year I spent 1 day. And now it's like the most beautiful, diverse understory you ever saw in your whole life. And for me, it was totally worth it.
It's good to hear.
I know that I want to say one other thing, which is I know that there are some spring ephemeral heads in the audience. So one of the interesting things about dealing with these invasive plants is that you can get really caught in like the negativity of it, like, oh, I hate this plant so much and I want to just like destroy it. And what I think is so much more helpful is when you look at these masses of plants, thinking not of like how much you want to get rid of this intruder, but think about how much more could be there. Right? How many more species of native plants could be there that just can't be there because of this human-created situation? In the case of my barberry patch, on this north to northeastern facing slope at this elevation, I knew that understory should be full of spring ephemeral wildflowers, right? And they just couldn't be there. And so they couldn't be there. And so all of these incredibly important, like specialized relationships that they have with insects couldn't be there. And so the ants that disperse their seeds couldn't be there. And so, that's when I was doing this work of controlling those invasives, I was like, I'm not killing anything. I'm planting wildflowers. And that's really what allowed me to like wrap my head around this work. Is it's not about what we're destroying, like it's about what we're creating and the opportunity to just have a forest that's more full of life.
Yeah, what a great way to turn that around. And you may have accidentally just answered the next question. And that's from Barry asking talk about our human desire to formalize and clean an area compared to what a forest really needs.
Yeah, so there was a brief mention of that in the second reading that I did, which it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to explain to people that there's no relationship between like a forest that looks good to us and like what a healthy forest actually looks like. That actually, um, an understanding of what a healthy forest or a healthy a lot. This is true for a lot of different ecosystems, actually. What they look like is not something that we're born with that we just magically like can tell. We need to develop it, and it's actually pretty unintuitive, counterintuitive in many cases. So, in the case of our old growth, when we look at our old growth ecosystems here in Vermont, the word that most people would use to describe them is messy, right? And that's actually true for a lot of different systems all across North America, where like when we, people are expecting to see these park-like areas of these big trees, and it's beautiful, and very infrequently is that actually what like these systems looked like. They looked messy, and in the ecological parlance, the way that we describe, what most people call messy is with this term complexity. Complexity is all of these different types of diversity, all of these different layers layered atop one another, and creating these things that we call emergent properties, which is where these ecosystems are like more than the sum of their parts. And so one of the things that I try to encourage people to do is to like get comfortable with the messiness, and even being like messy is good, and it's funny because there's actually been some research that's been done on this. E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, myrmecologist, celebrator of biodiversity. If you don't know E.O. Wilson, look him up. He's done collated some research that suggests that people are sort of predisposed to these like open park-like ecosystems, which he thinks is because those are the systems that we evolved in for tens of millions of years, these savanna-like ecosystems. And that in some way, on this very sort of like primal way, when we want to have these forests that are these park-like forests, we're like trying to find our habitat, like any other species does. But regardless of where that comes from, it's very primal. It's like people just want to see these tall, beautiful trees, this clear, open understory, no dead wood on the ground, no dead standing trees. And that, in my mind, is almost the opposite of what a healthy forest really looks like. And so it becomes a question of how do we reframe our expectations for these ecosystems?
I'm reframing my kitchen as complexity.
Yes.
So
It's not
that
messy,
is
it's just complex.
exactly. All right, Santa's asking, apart from your own book, are there other works that you're inspired by and would like to share with us?
Yeah, and I wish that I knew more about works like this in prairie systems, because I don't. But in forested systems, there's a book that I love that's called The Hidden Forest: Biography of an Ecosystem by John Luoma, and it's a really cool book. It's genius, really. It's about all of these forest scientists that came together to do like to get out of their different silos of like, I study forest insects, I study trees, I study this, that, and to describe this area in the Pacific Northwest called the Andrews Experimental Forest. And it's really, really cool. And so they're able to, of course, find when they stop studying, tunnel visioning in on just one little part of a forest, that there's all these different connections between these different aspects of forests. That's an awesome book. My favorite book piece of nature writing ever it's not a book about like ecology, but it's just wonderful book, is a book called Runes of the North by Sigurd Olsen. Any of Doug Tallamy's work, I think, would be really cool for you guys to check out. The Nature of Oaks, Nature's Best Hope. Doug is just super knowledgeable, especially about herbaceous plants, insect relationships. I really like, if any of you are beaver believers, out there, if you like beavers and you want to read a book that's going to make you think that beavers are just going to save the world, you can read this book called Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers by Ben Goldfarb. That's a wonderful book as well. There's a million of them. It's really like a cool space to be in.
It's hard to pick favorites, isn't it, among all the good books?
Yeah. But yeah, I think the other recommendation that I want to make is that just understanding, like, so yeah, check out How to Love a Forest, but then of course I want to make it really clear that, like, for you, if you are into these ideas that I talk about in How to Love a Forest, you're going to have to translate those to where you are. And that's why organizations like Wild Ones exist, right? Because we take these bigger concepts, and again, ecology is super local. And then you need to contact your local conservation organizations who can help you translate that into like what's appropriate to where you are. And one of the cool things, like especially when I worked for the state of Vermont, it would be like me, a lot of folks with government agencies and conservation NGOs and these groups. And our question when we were talking to each other was always like, how do we get people to show up for our events? How do we get people to sign up for our newsletter and consume these resources that we put all this work into, and follow us on social media and all these other things? And so now when people ask me, they're like, how do I get involved where I am? And I was like, I'm so glad you asked, because the conservation community where you are has been waiting to hear from you, right? And has the ability to tell you what you can do where you are, and help you understand the ecosystems in a more specific way where you are. So that's a plug for Wild Ones and for other like-minded conservation organizations.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We welcome everyone into our group, and we hope that our enthusiasm is wearing off to others. Mm-hmm. All right, Donald is asking, what key components do you look for when determining what is a healthy tree beyond roots, trunk, and crown? Since you're looking at an ecosystem, are there other clues, such as the kinds of animals that are present or soil components? So how do you decide? How do you decide what's healthy?
Healthy tree is weird, and a healthy tree and a healthy forest are two different answers. Mm-hmm. So it's one of these things where, like, it seems like the simplest question in the world, but when you think about forests and trees as much as I do, it becomes complicated. So basically, the standard definition of what like a healthy tree is what I would call like a metabolically healthy tree. So that's a tree that it has no wounds, it has no stressors, there's nothing getting in its way of just being like a healthy tree that can grow and reproduce and do all the things that trees need to do. And in a healthy forest, we need to have a lot of healthy trees. These trees with the smooth, tight bark and the nice, well-balanced crowns that are growing on a good site, all of these different things. But then also, if we had a forest that had only perfectly healthy trees, it would be a biological desert, which is interesting to think about, because so many of the most foundational and important attributes of forests come from trees that have stuff wrong with them, right? Or wrong with them. So trees that have things like cavities, holes in the tree, which only develop when the tree is stressed out, declining, and develops these things like internal rot. Trees that have died and are laying on the ground that provide all these important habitats and also do things like regulate forest hydrology, help build soils. These big old, the old school vernacular would be we call decadent trees that have these complex canopy structures and complex bark structures, these cavities, these deep expansive root systems, all of those different things. So for a forest to be healthy, it's not enough for like every individual tree to be that perfect vision of like a metabolically healthy tree. You actually have to have other things. You have to have unhealthy trees as well. And then it becomes a discussion of like, in the case of Bear Island, every tree was that unhealthy tree. And so what I really need more of now is more of that sort of metabolically healthy tree. Now you also have to layer on top of that that there's different tree species. In some cases, in Vermont, 60 different tree species. And so there can also be cases where you're thinking about where tree species are a good fit for the site. So we have this weird thing in Vermont where like most of our forests are made up not of tree species that are necessarily that would have been there historically. They're made up of tree species that happen to be good at growing in old fields, because almost every forest that we have was an old field 60 to 100 years ago within a single generation of trees. So in that case, I would be like, if this is a forest that should be all sugar maple, it's a rich, calcium-rich soils and perfect sugar maple site, and it's all white pine trees, I would still say that that was not a healthy forest, because for it to be a healthy forest, it should be like a better representation of trees that are actually well suited to that site. So I've gone and taken your simple question and just ruined it, and I'm sorry, but those are the things that I think about with that.
No, I think that is a perfect answer. And this is kind of a follow-up question accidentally. Sarah's asking, in terms of restoration or range migration, are you personally planting any native species sourced from their southern range on your own land? Why not?
Yeah, so I have the University of Vermont is doing a couple of experimental planting projects on my land. So they are. And so we have 3 species, red oak, white oak, chestnut oak. And then there's a number of experimental treatments. Some get deer protection, some don't. Some get weeded around with like a brush cutter, some don't. Some are of southern provenances, and some aren't. So we'll see. There is an interesting thing where in Vermont, like, I actually just made a video about this that I put out last weekend, if anyone follows me. There's this weird tension where we know that introducing new genetics can be good, right? We know there's this thing called hybrid vigor, where you introduce new genetics and it's adaptive. It's good, especially for inbred populations of different species. But the trade-off is that we also have these local genetic populations of a species that may have unique adaptations. And when we introduce new genetics into those regions, we may lose those unique genetics. So when we think about biodiversity, an often not considered component of biodiversity is genetic diversity. So we think about all the different species, but the genetic diversity within each species is also a really important part of that. And so sometimes when we're introducing new genetics, we worry that we're going to lose unique local genetics. But to a certain extent, with planting trees, we don't really have a choice, because we don't have enough nursery capacity to plant the trees that we need to plant only from local sources. And so that's just like a compromise that we've had to make in some cases, where we're just like, we need this tree species to be here, and there's no way to buy it with local genetics. And so we're just going to hope that it's okay.
Oh, that's interesting. It's thought-provoking, actually, to think of genetics and DNA diversity as well as, species.
Well, why I was thinking about it was because of foxes. You can tell I've been writing about foxes and like making videos about foxes. So with red foxes are they have the widest range of any terrestrial carnivore on Earth, terrestrial vertebrate carnivore. It's like they're in like Japan, they're in all across Asia, across Europe and North America. And across their range, the major threat to red foxes is other species of red foxes, whether they're all the same, or other subspecies, I should say. They're all the same species, Vulpes vulpes. But the genetic diversity that is lost is what happens when one subspecies takes over another, or starts hybridizing with another subspecies, and then suddenly these unique variants of foxes are lost. And it's a thing where we're just like, maybe that's a thing we need to accept. Maybe it's a thing that we don't accept. My inclination, just as a biodiversity lover and celebrator, is that I want to protect everything, But there, I am aware that we can't always do that.
No, there's always trade-offs. In fact, there was on the news this week that a coyote had swum onto Alcatraz, and um, there are endangered birds that nest on Alcatraz, but the coyote
Yeah.
got there naturally. So what do you do? So
Well, so and there's a similar thing in that we were talking about before this event started, that like all of the low elevation foxes in California, except for this one population, the Sacramento Valley fox, those are all non-native foxes that were introduced, that were from fur farms. They escaped from fur farms and now are like established at all these lower elevations in the West. And they have been problematic for all these ground nesting birds because there was just never a predator that did what foxes do there for thousands of years. And coyotes are a survivor. I mean, they've expanded their range. Like they were first seen in Vermont in like the 1940s, and now they have a good amount of wolf DNA and domestic dog DNA, and they've taken over or expanded their range throughout the eastern United States. Fascinating.
I think there's an entire session to be had on some of this information.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question though for you. Were there any American chestnuts on your land? And do you have any living stumps?
No, I don't have any living stumps. We're a little far north for that, but I think there could have been chestnuts there, and I have planted chestnuts. So I've done that's another one where I'm like, I think sometimes we're a little bit too puristic about the chestnut thing. So I've planted just some straight up American chestnut seedlings from that were their parents were potentially resistant trees. And I've planted some of those. But then in my orchard, I just have straight crosses. I have or either Chinese chestnuts or 50-50 American Chinese crosses.
Okay. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have. There's a lot of good comments in the chat in appreciation and thanks for your talk tonight. There's links to some of the books that you mentioned. How do people follow you on the socials? Do you have, can you mention or add to the chat what they are?
Sure. Well, I'll just tell you, it's all under at How to Love a Forest. So Instagram,
say that again.
At How to Love a Forest. Just like the name of the book. So it's Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, Blue Sky, Substack.
Way to claim that name.
Yeah. It's funny when I wasn't sure what the name of the book was, and then my editor was like, when she pitched it to her publisher, she was like, I love this book and I want to publish it, and I think it should be called How to Love a Forest. And I was like, oh, that's what it's called. That's what its name is, you know? But yeah, so on all those platforms, you can follow me there. I also write a monthly column that that's basically a book chapter that you can get by becoming a paid member on Substack or Patreon. And yeah. And then otherwise, EthanTapper.com.
We put that in there too. Oops, and I just screwed up the typing.
Ethan Tapper.
Excellent. Okay, well, I know we're running past the time that you've allotted to us, but what's amazing to me is that very few people have left the room. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. And I think based on what I'm seeing in the chat, there's a lot of people that appreciate what you've done with us tonight. So thank you. All right, everyone, thank you for attending, and I hope that we will see you on March 9th in Normal, at our normal location. No pun intended. Have a good night, everyone. Good night.
Good night.